The physical scale of the dead is difficult to process. Across Europe, Africa, and Asia, an estimated 200 million people perished. In Europe alone, up to half the entire population was wiped out in a few years. While people at the time viewed this as divine retribution, the death toll resulted from human progress. The devastation required a collision of urban expansion, booming populations, and extensive new trade routes. In the drive to connect the world and generate wealth, we built the ultimate delivery system for a lethal pathogen. The networks designed to sustain life became the engine of its near extinction. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Empire had unified the Eurasian steppe. This period of stability, the Pax Mongolica, allowed overland trade to expand. Merchants and their caravans crisscrossed a massive network of outposts, linking China to the Middle East. At the western edge of these routes sat the Italian city-states. These merchant empires expanded their maritime reach to bring Eastern luxury goods into Europe. They built dense, highly populated urban centers directly on the water, positioned to take in a constant flow of ships. But this economic high point masked a severe ecological vulnerability. Following a period of agricultural abundance, Europe's population had swelled to around 80 million. Then the climate cooled, crop yields crashed, and starving rural populations flooded into the cities. Urban infrastructure could not keep up. Streets filled with refuse, and sewage was tossed directly from windows. Europe reached a Malthusian deadlock. Millions of malnourished people were packed into filthy, unregulated hubs that were directly plugged into the largest global trade network in human history. The continent was primed for a biological spark. That spark was Yersinia pestis, an adaptive bacterium. Unlike most infections that the human body can fight off, Yersinia pestis evades the immune system. It invades the lymphatic nodes, the organs supposed to destroy foreign bodies, and uses them as a breeding ground, multiplying at a ferocious rate. To travel, the bacteria relied on the oriental rat flea. When an infected flea consumes a blood meal, the plague bacteria multiply inside the insect. They form a dense mass that blocks the flea's foregut, making it impossible for the insect to digest food. Starving, the blocked flea goes into a biting frenzy. As it attempts to feed, it cannot swallow. Instead, it regurgitates the highly infectious bacterial mass back into the bloodstream of its host. The vehicle for these fleas was the black rat. Originating in Asia, the black rat is intelligent and capable of breeding in millions. Its jaws can gnaw through lead, unhardened concrete, and thick wood. Medieval city walls and ship holes offered little resistance. Nature had engineered a biological weapon, an invisible bacterial killer, driven into hosts by a starving insect, riding an unstoppable transport system. In 1346, this pathogen reached the Crimean Peninsula at the Siege of Kaffa. A Tartar army was attempting to conquer the fortified Genoese trading city, but as the siege dragged on, the attackers began dying from a mysterious disease. The Tartar Khan loaded the swollen corpses of his own men onto catapults and launched them over Kaffa's stone walls. The bodies shattered on impact, aerosolizing the bacteria and inviting infected camp rats into the city. The Genoese defenders panicked. As the plague tore through their streets, merchants packed onto departing galleys, desperate to escape. They did not know that deep in the dark holds of their ships, infected rats were traveling with them. A localized military conflict had breached the perimeter of Europe. Those fleeing ships transformed the Mediterranean maritime network into a mass distribution system for the plague. When those galleys docked in Italian ports, the plague pushed inland. It marched across the continent at an average of 2.5 miles every day, crossing rivers and mountain passes without slowing down. These charts show the lethality of the disease across its 3 variants. The bubonic form, characterized by swollen lymph nodes, carried a 60% mortality rate. The pneumonic variant, which infected the lungs and spread through the air, killed 95% of its victims. And the septicemic form, where bacteria flooded the bloodstream, resulted in a 100% death rate. The speed of death was difficult to grasp. A person could begin feeling ill and be dead 14 hours later. Families would kiss healthy loved ones goodnight, only to find them lifeless by morning. Cities enacted extreme measures to halt the spread. Venice seized incoming ships and burned them. In Milan and parts of Poland, authorities walled up infected individuals inside their own homes, bricking families into what became their own tombs. The psychological terror drove people to violent extremes. Bands of flagellants marched through the streets, whipping themselves in hopes of appeasing a displeased God. When that failed, communities looked for scapegoats, rounding up and burning Jewish populations alive. From physicians to the highest levels of the church, established authorities found their traditional tools incapable of halting the infection. For the majority of the population, the existing medieval framework struggled to withstand the pressures of the pandemic. By 1353, the Black Death finally burned out. It left behind a silenced, decimated European landscape. Entire villages had been wiped off the map. But this graph reveals a counterintuitive economic outcome. With half the population gone, the massive oversupply of labor that had defined the previous century vanished overnight. Surviving peasants were now a valuable commodity. Workers who were previously indentured to the land now had leverage. They demanded higher wages. The Malthusian deadlock was broken. Peasants could accumulate wealth, improve their standard of living, and migrate to new towns. The staggering death toll shattered the rigid structure of the feudal system. The landed gentry lost their control over the working class, marking the beginning of the end for medieval serfdom. The psychological shift was equally profound. The church and the medical establishment had failed to stop the dying. A traumatized society began to question these traditional pillars of authority. This skepticism seeped into the culture. Art movements like the Danse Macabre emerged, depicting skeletons dancing alongside the living. It was a visual reminder that in the face of death, kings, popes, and peasants were all equal. This need for better answers ignited an intellectual shift. Doctors began investigating physical causes for disease rather than celestial alignments. This skepticism of old dogmas contributed to the intellectual shifts of the Renaissance and the religious upheavals of the Reformation. The Black Death resulted in more loss of life than any conflict in history. By dismantling the structures that had frozen medieval society in place, the pandemic became the event that accelerated the transition into the modern world.